Britain is going back into a pre-Christmas lockdown to help tackle rising cases of COVID. Around the world, coronavirus has affected not just our health, but our politics. The power that governments have assumed over their people has opened a new front in the culture war. Peter Hitchens is a familiar voice, columnist for The Mail on Sunday and author of a provocative essay in the magazine The Critic titled Democracy Muzzled, and Peter joined me from Oxford.
I think I've never seen in quite a long life such a huge sacrifice of personal liberty, nor such a huge deliberate damage undertaken by governments to their own economies. And it seems to me you'd need a very, very strong justification for actions of this kind, which has not been established. Both politics and the media seem to be almost incapable of skepticism anymore, or of serious opposition. So these things have barely been questioned, and those who have questioned them have often been subject to a great amount of quite severe personal abuse and very little rational response. And when distinguished scientists, particularly I think of the Great Barrington Declaration, and people such as John Ioannidis and Suchrit Bhakti have raised doubts about the approach, they've been marginalized. It's been quite shocking to anybody who's concerned with true freedom of thought and speech.
But just before we came on air, Peter, I took a look at the latest figures, which say 64,170 COVID-related deaths in the UK, perhaps as many as 20,000 new cases a day. Surely that in itself has been justification for these precautions, even if they have been excessive?
It's been a similar event, slightly bigger, but not hugely bigger, to crises which happen in most certain Northern Hemisphere health services every year, of the winter crisis caused by influenza or pneumonia among the old, which raises the current mortality rate and which puts pressure on hospital systems, which certainly in the case of my own country have been greatly cut back in recent years and invariably undergo pressure. It really is a matter of examining these figures more critically and not accepting without question that they mean what the government says they mean. I was brought up with the old Bismarckian watchword, never believe anything until it's been officially denied. It's a very simple rule, particularly for journalists, and particularly for opposition politicians, to be careful not to take at face value everything that's presented to you. There have also been many, many other problems raised about the recording of deaths with COVID rather than of COVID. Even the quite senior medical officials in Britain have pointed out that this is the case. Are we actually telling ourselves an accurate story? My answer to that is quite possibly not. And as long as a serious debate isn't heard, I'll continue to think that. The other thing is this: if you do oppose this, as I have done, two things happen. One, you drop almost entirely off the air. And radio stations and TV programs which previously invited you reasonably frequently just don't call. And the other is that you are subject to quite a lot of really rather angry abuse. And I've always taken, having changed my mind myself, and I know this sensation, I've always taken anger at a point of view as being a sign that the person who's angry has deep doubts about his own position.
Well, look, Peter, you and I have known each other for a decade. We are friends, I should say that. And I know that you're a very smart man. When you get sick, you go to the doctor. And if the doctor says, Peter, look, you've got a throat infection, take this antibiotic, you'll get better. Aren't these lockdowns the sort of collective version of the antibiotic? It's the best that we can do in the circumstances, even when it's not good.
No, they're much more medieval than that. Everybody presumes, and this has been one of the great failings of media around the world, that there is an actual causal link between the number of deaths and the severity of these shutdowns. In fact, if you look at all the countries in the world which have attempted to shut down, some countries have had high death rates and far from severe policies. Some countries have very severe policies and very high death rates. And you simply cannot find a pattern, even of correlation. As we all know, correlation is not necessarily causation, but it sometimes gives a strong clue to it. But there isn't even a correlation on which you could base an examination of causation. At the beginning, the government's claims, certainly in my country, were a lot more modest. They said, we can spread the disease over a longer time. Maybe that they can, or maybe that they can't do this. But everybody in this debate presumes that it is true that these measures are effective without examination. It's that, again, that question, without examination. People do not examine what they are told.
I was very interested in a recent essay that you wrote for the new magazine, The Critic. And Peter, you argued there that, for example, something that would seem pretty innocuous, like wearing a mask, how does a mask become the kind of thin edge of a wedge on Enlightenment values?
I don't think I used the term thin end of the wedge.
No,
There is something highly symbolic about it. There's also, again, a huge question of evidence. And you have heard of the Danish mask study, which is the only serious study undertaken for the effectiveness of masks, which showed that in preventing people from catching the disease, they're almost wholly ineffective. It didn't attempt to discover whether they prevented the spread of the disease to others, which is the big claim now made for them. But the truth is that there has never been any serious, hard experimental evidence that they're any use, and their promotion by governments came along quite late. But what it does do is it spreads regimentation. It uses people to spread the idea that there is a perpetual fear. It spreads the atomization among people. And you also find in the actions of some police forces, and I noted particularly the Victorian police force in Melbourne, who had demonstrators who were rounded up for protesting against the measures there, found the police actually putting masks forcibly over their faces. This is an intrusion in personal freedom. Now, I myself, for instance, have always opposed any attempts to make laws against Muslim women wearing hijabs or niqabs on the street. It's absolutely not the business of the government to tell people what to wear beyond the basic requirements of human modesty. This is, first of all, an intrusion into personal decisions greater than any I've ever seen in my life. Secondly, it's unjustified by any hard scientific evidence. And thirdly, it is an imposition of the most extraordinary conformism. And the symbolic nature of it, the mouthless, voiceless state into which people are reduced by the wearing of these garments, is again a revolution in the relations between power and the individual. And I find it very, very disturbing.
Has COVID become, in its own sort of bizarre way, the kind of new culture war?
It has been a great opportunity for those who have, I think probably for quite a long time, hoped for a stronger state. There's been a growing impulse, in my view, for a stronger state in the Western countries for some long time, since the more or less total collapse of Christianity as a moral force. It was inevitable. It's a simple Burkean point. If people have less reason to restrain themselves from within, then they're going to find that they need more restraint from without. And we observe the change in police forces all over the English-speaking world, leaving out of this perhaps the American problem, which is different. But the old Anglosphere, the old Commonwealth countries, police forces which used to be uniformed in non-militaristic outfits and not to carry clubs or guns or openly display handcuffs, have become much more swaggering, heavily equipped, pepper sprayed, armed, whatever else you have, and uniformed in a way which is frankly designed to intimidate. This transformation which has come over Western societies, and particularly over my own country and perhaps yours as well, is very notable to me.
Well, in Victoria, Peter, they wear black in head to toe, I've got to tell you, the police.
I'm told it's called Salute Blue, but yes, I know, it is quite disturbing to me, who grew up with a police force which was famously unarmed and restrained, and which very seldom drew its truncheon, never displayed its ability of physical force until absolutely and hugely provoked to what we have now, which is a sort of paramilitary militia. And I find that I think people who've decided to try and create a state of that kind must have seen this as an opportunity. The regulations, because the basic rule of all crises is never let a good crisis go to waste. If you have an agenda and a crisis comes along, there's probably a chance to pursue it.
It's a rather odd agenda, though, for the left to pursue, I would have thought, because I think lockdown has created all kinds of, what I would have thought were unintended consequences for the left, hasn't it?
Well, I don't know. You see, it depends what the left now is. I thought that there'd been a transformation in the left. It had become quite different from what it had been. And it's also very noticeable that in my country, probably the main left-wing newspaper, The Guardian, which has for long been the paper which you would turn to for concern about civil liberties and matters of that kind, has ceased to be like that. It's also become a bit of a warmonger's gazette. The left, I think, having become more powerful in our society and in our state, is much less concerned with the gentle treatment of dissent than it used to be, precisely because it is so much more powerful and because it believes it can use the power of the state for idealistic purposes. The left is actually much more now on the side of authority than it used to be, precisely because it has more authority.
Well, it also strikes me, though, Peter, that it seems to be on the side of the super wealthy, because they have certainly benefited from the COVID lockdowns in much of the Western world.
Well, I suppose the super wealthy will benefit from almost any crisis of this kind because they're able to purchase more assets and so insulate themselves from whatever may happen. And whether this is, again, an accident or intentional, I don't know. But it is the case that the modern world, and I have said this before, is the hideous love child of Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. As the left in the West increasingly abandoned its former concern with the elevation of the working class, trade unionism, social democracy, and became much more of a cultural movement, communism's main national stronghold, China, became simultaneously much more interested in promoting capitalism, and to get rich was glorious. There really isn't anymore in politics anywhere in the world the old divide between a plutocratic conservative right and a social democratic left. The divisions in politics are quite different. Soon after Deng Xiaoping was saying to get rich is glorious, the new Labour government in Britain was saying they were completely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. This isn't really the concern of the left anymore. People haven't quite gathered how much of a transformation there has been in the nature and desires of the left. And you will confuse yourself almost into madness if you try to apply the old left-wing desires, human freedom, peace rather than war, strong trade unions and things of that kind, with the desires of the new left, which are a cultural and moral revolution of actually a much wider scale.
Just finally, Peter, I want to ask you about what must surely be the great ethical conundrum here, though, and that is the epidemiologists, the scientists, not people whom we see on the front pages normally hankering for great power. Surely it is their ethical duty to give you the kind of 100% solution, as close to it as possible, even though there may be unintended consequences of the 100% solution that they're offering. How has that ethical problem and that ethical dilemma really manifested itself to you?
I've never, ever worked on the assumption that my opponents in this matter are motivated by wicked desires. I think they're motivated entirely by benevolence, and they believe very strongly that what they're doing is good. And I don't doubt their motives or impugn them. I just think that there are divisions among the groups of scientists you mentioned, particularly among epidemiologists. For instance, in the city in which I now speak to you, in Oxford, Sunetra Gupta puts forward a completely different assessment of what we should be doing and the actual state of the spread of the virus, and has taken part in this Great Barrington Declaration, the almost entirely unpublicized but hugely important declaration of opposition to these policies by very large numbers of scientists. You cannot use science in which there is constant disagreement and development as a way of ending debate and saying, I am morally right. There's moral rightness on both sides in this, and both groups of people believe strongly that what they're doing is for the public good. But we're still left with judgments about which of them is right, and I think that debate has not been held. One of the worst things about the behavior of the Western media in the past 6 or 7 months has been that they have not even presented the fact that there is a division on this matter, and that millions of people are unaware that there are serious, intelligent, learned people who dispute the wisdom of what we're doing.
Well, it's good to talk to you, as always, even if it's taken us many months to get back to you. Peter Hitchens, columnist with The Mail on Sunday, author of a fascinating essay in the new magazine The Critic. It's called Democracy Muzzled. Peter, thank you very much for joining us on the Religion and Ethics Report.
It's been my pleasure.